You know that saying, my life suddenly flashed before my eyes? Well, according to a new study, that might actually happen. Researchers examined the brain activity of a dying man and found unexpected activity in the memory retrieval area of the brain, suggesting that, in fact, we might actually replay significant events right before we die. So, joining us with more is CTV Science and Technology specialist Dan Riskin. Dan, good morning to you. Tell
Good
us how
morning.
they discovered this. What did they find?
Well, so this is an interesting set of circumstances that presented themselves. There was an 87-year-old man. He was in hospital. He had fallen and hit his head, and he had some bruising on the brain, and he was having trouble. And they were doing their best to offer care to this guy. And he'd been in the hospital about 2 days, and they were scanning his brain to try to figure out what exactly was happening because he was starting to have seizures. And while his brain was being scanned, while he was getting his EEG done, he passed away. And there was a do not resuscitate order, so they let him pass peacefully. But
Mhm.
as they did so, they recorded data on what happens in the brain when a person dies. And this hasn't happened before because you can't set up a protocol or an experiment to do that. This is something that just sort of landed in their lap. So they acknowledge it's just one person, and they acknowledge that he had a head injury and that they'd been giving him some drugs to treat that injury. But nonetheless, it gives you an insight into what goes on in the brain because you'd expect the brain to just sort of quiet down and then go to silence. But in fact, what happened was right in the moments before death, it came to life with all kinds of electrical activity in the parts of the brain and the kinds of activity that you would see with memory retrieval, with processing of events. So big thoughts happening in the brain in those last moments.
Well, we've heard this, right, anecdotally from people for years, and those scenes are replayed in movies that we watch where, somebody's life flashes before their eyes. Uh, can they tell by monitoring those brainwaves what he was thinking about, what his brain was retrieving?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, they can't read what the thoughts are exactly, but they definitely see that things light up in a way that suggests that it's a very involved experience. Now, this has been shown before for mice, which actually I find quite interesting because you don't think about, sorry, it was rats, not mice, but you don't think about rodents having their light flash before their eyes. But we saw this same kind of electrical activity in the rats. And so
Not
it was a
unless you're
big question.
Ratatouille.
Right, Ratatouille accepted, of course. Yeah. So, but that does sort of point out that the living creatures have very similar experiences across different biota. So when you look at this person, we really didn't know what to expect, and so when we saw this electrical activity, it really, for a lot of people, reinforced what they already believed, and for other researchers, they thought this was a big surprise. But nonetheless, even though it's a sample size of one person, I think it really does point out that something pretty fundamental happened, at least for that one person, that one time.
So we figured out that this might, in fact, actually happen, but what will they do with that information? What does it teach us?
Because it's biomedical research, there's an intuitive knee-jerk reaction to say, how can we do this to treat people and help them, to live longer lives, to do something to change how death happens. Some researchers have said, you know what, this is about the way life ends. This is where doctors take their hands off the wheel, and we let people pass, and it's just interesting for that reason. But I think more fundamentally, I think it does speak to that thing that we're all curious about. We all want to know what that transition is like, where the life ends. Does something else begin, or does it just end altogether? And knowing more about that moment, I think, is of fundamental interest to so many people, separate from trying to keep people alive longer, separate from trying to treat disease. I think people just want to know what happens in that moment, and this gives us a clue about what does happen.
Dan, you mentioned how rare it is for scientists to be able to study when this happens. Will they be able to continue the study?
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is something that sort of they've flagged, and so people now know what kinds of data were collected, and if people want to collect similar data, they can do that. There have been, of course, studies on people who have chosen to end their lives and who are sedated and euthanized and pass away that way. But this is really the first time where someone has had a natural death where they passed away by surprise, and we managed to get this recording. So it's going to have to rely on lady luck to get more data like this. But in the meantime, it gives an important clue about what goes on. It points out that what happens in the human brain really is quite similar to what we've seen in rodents. So we can do more experiments on rodents. And, for a lot of us, it just really gives you a moment to sort of sit there and think about what it would be like to have your life flash before your eyes. And just a little bit of an indication that maybe that is exactly what we will experience.
That is fascinating. Dan Riskin, always interesting to speak with you. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this, be sure to subscribe here, or you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.